Hello and good evening, everyone. Today I'm speaking to another recurring guest. It's Dave DeCamp from Antiwar.com. He's the editor over there. It's what I regard as a very important website to bring the anti-war message across the world. So, Dave, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Mm. So we're in 2023. Nobody has, there hasn't been a new war started since we last spoke, but there's still some ongoing conflicts like Russia, Ukraine, stuff in Somalia, whatever. Can you maybe give us sort of like a broad overview of what's happening around the world?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the big one, of course, is Russia, Ukraine, which is what most everybody is focused on. And unfortunately, going into the new year, things are looking pretty bad. It doesn't look like there's any sign that there's going to be peace talks or any kind of diplomatic solution. Because right now, where the two sides stand, you have Ukraine demanding Russia withdraw, and they want Russia to face war crimes tribunals before they can even have talks. So it's an unrealistic demand on Ukraine's side. And then on the Russian side, they're saying that those territories they annex, that they're never leaving. They're going to capture the rest of those oblasts that they annex in the east. um, so they're just so far apart. And then you have the Americans and NATO just slowly still increasing aid for Ukraine. So,
And aid is calling it generous, right? I mean, they're
yeah,
just
yeah.
throwing cash at it.
They're throwing money and weapons and also intelligence and training. I mean, they have all these big plans for Ukraine. So for the U.S. and most of NATO, there's some NATO members that aren't really on board with this, like Turkey and Hungary. But for most of NATO, they're all in and they have big plans. They want to turn Ukraine into a huge NATO army on Russia's border, which they've pretty much done already, even though they're not technically a member. So unfortunately for the people of Ukraine, because they're facing these brutal Russian, strikes on their energy infrastructure, they're without power and heat this winter. Things just are really bad for them. And unfortunately, there's no sign that it's going to ease up. The one thing Putin did order today, a Christmas truce for the Orthodox Christmas, which is this
Okay.
Saturday, which is supposed to take effect Friday at noon and last through Saturday. But Ukraine says, they kind of rejected it. I don't know, but hopefully a little calm would be good, I think, for the country. And so we'll see what happens with that. But so that's really where we're at with Ukraine. It's not looking good again. And then the other kind of big thing that's happening is the US and China and the way that the US is really increasing support for Taiwan.
But that's the thing that the US doesn't seem like it seems to be wanting to pick a fight with everyone at this stage. I mean, at least that's my sign of it. No, it's obviously Putin's actions is making it very easy for them to pick a fight. And I don't know really what China. It seems China is somewhat restrained in their response, but they're also not backing down of Taiwan, right? So it's just constant escalation.
Yeah, I mean that's really the theme of the Biden administration, but also in general of American administrations over the past few decades is escalate. With everybody. I mean, you look at there's a lot of stuff for us to talk about because they're escalating with Iran and Somalia and China. So it's just everywhere. North Korea, South, the Korean Peninsula tensions are very high. But when it comes to China, like you said, China's not going to back down on Taiwan. It's a very important issue for them. And what the US is doing right now, this really started under Trump. What they call the Asia pivot, the US kind of focusing on the Asia Pacific and China, that started under Obama. But with Trump, he really started increasing ties with Taiwan because, so since, just for a quick background, if people don't know, the situation with Taiwan is pretty strange. The U.S. severed diplomatic relations with them in the 1970s to open up with China. So they don't recognize Taiwan as a country, but they have informal relations and they sell them
Yeah.
weapons. They've sold them weapons since then. But this kind of weird arrangement is the whole basis of U.S.-China relations. And what the U.S. has done in the past few years is they're kind of changing that. They're starting to sell them more weapons. They're starting to send high-level officials to Taiwan. They just opened trade talks and things like that. China is not happy about. And Uh,
So the defense to that would be, I mean, some people in Taiwan would say, but we don't like this thing with China. I mean, like, what do you? And this is a problem with all these conflicts, is that there's always a reason to justify the US's rationale, right? I mean, Ukraine is a very similar example. But the people in Taiwan would say, okay, but we don't want the superpower in our neck, and therefore we're going to get the US to be, our big buddy. I mean, it's like, how do you like respond to that?
well, yeah, I mean, and that's why, if you go back in the history, it's really U.S. intervention in the Chinese Civil War that kind of created this whole situation because, um, so Chiang Kai-shek, who was the Chinese nationalist who was fighting Mao in the Civil War, his forces fled to Taiwan, at the end of in 1949, and Mao during the 1950s, he wanted to finish them off in Taiwan, and the U.S. intervened. And I don't know if he really had the capability even to invade the Taiwan, but the U.S. Intervened, sending aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Strait, backing Taiwan against China. And things really started from there when it comes to the U.S. and China relationship over Taiwan. And you're right, there's a lot of people on Taiwan that don't want to be part of China, and they have every right to not want that. But when it comes to just the reality of the situation and where Taiwan is with respect to the U.S., it's just really not in the U.S. interest to really go all in on this island that's right off China's coast. And if this situation that they've had since the 70s, what they call strategic ambiguity, where the U.S. gives Taiwan a little support, but not enough for them to declare independence, that has held, the peace. But the message here is that the U.S. is changing that by
Yeah.
starting to increase relations with Taiwan. And again, when it comes to people on Taiwan that want independence, that's fine for them. But I just don't think the U.S. should support it because it's going to lead to war between the U.S. and China, which just can't happen.
Yeah, and I mean, a nuclear power war, I mean, I mean, it sort of speaks to Russia, Ukraine as well. I mean, somewhere along the line, people forgot that we have these big nuclear weapons that can blow a hole into any country in the world. And we just seem to not care about them at this stage.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. I mean, it seems like a lot of people, there were people seriously calling for, the US and NATO to directly intervene in Ukraine to fight Russia. And yet it just seems like they've forgotten about the risk of nuclear war. Um, but so just to get into how, the US is increasing ties with Taiwan, really the big thing that just happened was the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the US's military spending bill that they pass every year. The one that Congress just passed and Biden signed, it includes military aid for Taiwan. It includes loans for them to buy more U.S. weapons, $2 billion each year.
Wow.
Now, the U.S. has always sold weapons to Taiwan, but they never financed, the purchase. So it's a big change. And it also includes these amendments saying to increase military cooperation with Taiwan. They want to let them participate in military drills in the region. And this China's not going to take this. And after Biden signed the NDAA, they launched some pretty major drills around Taiwan. So you always see, whenever you see a big Chinese military presence around Taiwan, it's usually in response to the US or Europe or Japan sometimes, sending an official there, doing something to increase ties. So if you remember in August, Nancy Pelosi, who was the House Speaker, she's not anymore, I don't think. She might still be, I'm not sure, because the Republicans aren't voting in their guy. But
Right.
so she went in August, and China warned against, don't do this, don't do this. And she went. And China launched its largest ever military drills around Taiwan. They simulated a blockade. They fired missiles over the island. It shows how seriously they take this,
Yeah.
but they're not stopping. The U.S. is not listening to China's warnings. And
No, because there's a thing in U.S. diplomacy now where, and I mean, it's always been there, but it's sort of like everything is Munich, everything, any
yeah,
form of negotiation in the world is Adolf Hitler invading the Sudetenland. It doesn't matter how absurd the claim is.
yeah, that is, you're right. I mean, you can't even really call it diplomacy anymore. Because if around the time Pelosi was going, because it leaked to the media that she was going to go and China was warning against it. I mean, you saw all these Democrats, Republicans too, of course, but Democrats like just saying, "Oh, she has to go," she has to stand up to the Chinese communists, and like, for what? What did her trip accomplish but increase tensions? And maybe that was the goal, because then after that is when they started passing all this new military aid. That's when they started working on it. Was around then.
And did they increase the military budget this year again? Because I mean, your budget is just like
Oh yeah, by
skyrocketing.
8%. Yeah. So it's 858 billion, and that's not really the true number, because the Ukraine aid isn't included in there, and that's military spending, and also for like the intelligence agencies. When it comes to military spending, it really is over $1 trillion a year. But the NDAA itself right now is 858 billion. Last year it was 813 billion, so it's a pretty big.
So wait, a billion is 9 numbers, so it's almost we're getting into 12 numbers things. You have to look it up how much it is.
Yeah, yeah, it's just a crazy amount of money, and it's
Yeah.
just going to keep increasing, because Biden. Actually, no, I was wrong. Last year it was 782 billion, so this year it's 858 billion. That's a huge increase. So yeah, it's just going to keep going up.
And do you feel like, I mean, there's ever any control over where this money goes or what the intelligence agencies or the military does? Because, I mean, when you spend that much money, you create, I mean, it's effectively like a country. I mean, if it were its own country, it'd be like 10 or 12 largest country in the world, which is ridiculous. There seems to be no control sometimes over where this money goes and what's being done with it. And that's where you get all these rogue elements as well.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I mean, when it comes to just waste, if you look at just over the years, all the weapons makers in the U.S. have consolidated, and there's only there's not really any competition when it comes to building weapons. So they just spend as like there's so much waste that goes into making these fighter jets and tanks. Like, if you compare it to other countries' militaries, like what their equipment costs, the U.S. stuff is just like astronomical, and it's going to increase more, because another thing that this spending bill did was that it gave the Pentagon what they're calling wartime purchasing powers to buy more weapons for Ukraine. They're going to allow them to just lifting restrictions on them purchasing weapons. So just to make it faster, to streamline it, but that's going to allow the weapons makers to charge more, and there's even less competition, and they're pretty much in a position where they can make as many weapons, they could sell as many weapons as they can make. And they're going to these extreme lengths to really increase production because of all this stuff they're sending Ukraine.
And the weapons in Ukraine, I mean, we should talk a bit about that, because there was a report, I think it was PBS, if I'm not mistaken, that, questioned whether or not, the weapons actually arrived in Ukraine or something of that sort. I mean, is that still the case? And do we know, where they're going to end up?
Well, yeah, that was CBS. They put out a short documentary, I think it was in August, and they quoted somebody who said only like 30% of the weapons are making it to the front lines, like they're disappearing into Ukraine. And they actually pulled the documentary because the Ukrainian government wasn't happy about it. So they totally retracted it. They said they were going to put it out again with some corrections, but they never did. But that documentary was shot back in April, and they've said since they've taken steps to increase oversight, which they definitely have to some extent. But I think still it's really hard for them to track these weapons. And also, I think it was Finland, their national law enforcement agency, said that weapons from Ukraine are being sent to Ukraine are ending up on the black market, in the Nordic countries. And also in Nigeria. Nigeria's president said that terrorists in the Lake Chad region are getting weapons from Ukraine, from the war. So they could be being spread all over the place.
Well, I mean, I had a conversation here with Jasmine Opperman, who knows a lot about the Mozambican conflict, and she told me the weapons in Mozambique are being smuggled from all over the world.
Mhm.
It seems to be weapon like it doesn't. There's no border that stops a weapon from going somewhere.
Yeah.
And I'm waiting for it to end up in the streets of Marseille or Eastern European countries that's always had gang problems. It won't surprise me if there's going to be some big hole there as well.
Yeah, and that's what I believe the Finnish law enforcement, they said it was gangs that were, getting a hold of them and selling them. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely going to happen. And it was funny because that CBS documentary, they interviewed this guy. forget his name, but he's from the Mozart group, which was basically a mercenary group that was training. He was an American former Marine
One of the
training
commenters, yes,
Ukrainians.
Andrew Milburn, I suppose that's the guy.
Yeah, that's him. That's
Yeah.
him. And he said they asked him, "Oh, do you care?" Like I forget exactly how they phrased the question, but he's like, "Are you worried about these weapons winding up in the wrong hands?" Because he was saying they weren't all making it where they should have been going, and he said, "No, I don't care at all about that. Of course, that's going to happen." Like he just totally dismissed it. But so I think
Yeah.
that's the attitude of a lot of people.
Yeah, no, it's insanity what's going on over here. And I mean, just to sort of to get to Ukraine, and it's tragic that Ukraine is the only conflict we're focusing on, because nobody's focusing on Yemen, for example, that is, as devastated and things of that sort. But I mean, I guess Ukraine, the risk is really high because it is, nuclear weapons that are involved. But do we have a good sense of the amount of, dead soldiers, or things of like how much destruction has been in the country?
When it comes to the casualty rate, it's pretty tough because the two sides kind of are giving such different numbers. I know that I'm not even really sure. I kind of stopped trying to figure it out because it was so hard to. But I know that U- Ukraine is saying they've killed over 100,000 Russian soldiers, which seems like a lot. And
Yeah.
recently they just had this HIMARS strike, which is the U.S. provided rocket system on a school in Donetsk that was housing Russian troops, and Russia confirmed that it killed 89 soldiers. So that's a pretty big casualty event, but we haven't seen many like that. Excuse me. Throughout the war. So I'm really not sure. I forget what Russia says their death toll is. And when it comes to the Ukrainian side, they're also not really reporting casualties. Recently, the head of the EU's European Commission said that over 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed, but then they like retracted what she said because Ukraine got upset. So it could be that high. They are taking heavy casualties in Donetsk.
Well, what I've been seeing, and I also stopped following it. I mean, I actually stopped following the war a few months ago already, because you just can't keep up with the crazy stories in the media, and you
Yeah,
sort of know half of it is propaganda, so why bother sometimes? But
yeah.
what I've seen is that whenever Ukraine is advancing, or they're in a difficult situation, it's a low casualty rate. And whenever the US needs to renew the budget, they seem to report a high casualty rate, because then they need more weapons, So the answer is somewhere between the two.
Yeah, that's right. And I know like Zelensky has kind of cracked down on the media. The government has a lot of control on the information that's being put out. So it's tough to say. Like you said, I really focus my when it comes to the war in Ukraine more on the political side of the US involvement and that escalations there. The battlefield stuff is pretty hard to follow. Um, some people are good at it, but again, it's just really hard to know. And I do think Ukraine has taken some very heavy casualties in the fighting. So I wouldn't be surprised if they've lost over 100,000 troops.
And in Russia, I asked my friends who are in Russia, and they say something similar to what we would be saying. They stop following the news as well, because it's just, from their side, it's the same propaganda. We are winning the fatherland, all that crap, and
Yeah.
you sort of know it isn't true. And I know, my wife's got one friend from Russia. Her brother has now been called up for conscription, for example. So they have started conscripting some young men. Not all of them, but it is selective, and there is a lottery system. So even on that side, there seems to be, misleading figures and stuff as well.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, again, it is just so tough to follow.
Mm. In terms of this year, there were other conflicts that I saw a little bit on anti-war. Syria, you said the US, I think it was this morning, where the US opposed normalizing relationship with Syria. So, is the Middle Eastern wars even over yet?
No, they're not. They're definitely much more limited than they were, a few years ago. But when it comes to Syria, what the US is doing to Syria is pretty cruel because right, they have about 1,000 troops in eastern Syria, which doesn't sound like much, but they also back the SDF, which is a Kurdish militant group. And by backing them, the U.S. basically controls a portion of eastern Syria. It's about 1/3 of the country, and that's, of
Wow.
course, the government in Damascus isn't happy about that. So it's an occupation. And that part of the country has most of their oil resources, so they're depriving the rest of Syria of those resources. the U.S. has in really crippling sanctions on Syria. That, according to Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, he said this: the purpose of these sanctions is to oppose the reconstruction of Syria. They're
Wow.
specifically designed to target their energy and construction sectors so they can't rebuild. And the official position is oppose the reconstruction until, how they put it, there's a political change in Damascus, but it's really regime change. That's still the policy. But realistically, we know Assad isn't going anywhere. And there was just a pretty extensive report from a UN special rapporteur, Elena Duhan is her name, about how the sanctions on Syria, which we know sanctions always hurt ordinary people, but how they're really having a devastating impact on civilians in Syria, regular people, depriving them of medicine and their food insecure. So it's just really a siege basically on Syria that the U.S. has. And on top of that, Israel is always bombing Syria, and they say that they're targeting, Iranian weapons shipments. They often, lately, they've been targeting the Damascus airport a lot, knocking it out of service. And the U.S. kind of backs that. So it's actually really reminiscent of, in the 1990s, between the Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq, when the U.S. had sanctions and imposed a no-fly zone on Iraq. That's kind of what's happening right now
Yeah.
with Syria and with the normalization. So countries are starting to accept the fact that Assad's not going anywhere. Even countries that backed, the regime change effort against him. The UAE, I think they normalized with Assad back in
Yeah, they
2021.
don't care. They just want the money,
Yeah, they're like, okay, I guess he's not going, so let's just start, talking to him and trading with them again. And Turkey right now is starting to talk with Syria, and that's a pretty big deal because Turkey backed a ton of groups against Assad. That they still occupy areas of northern Syria and back fighters on the ground. So they began talking. So that story at antiwar.com today is the State Department saying we oppose, in response to what Turkey's doing, we oppose countries normalizing with Assad. So they don't want Syria's neighbors to open up.
Turkey seems to be, though, a bit of a rogue element in NATO because
Yeah.
it doesn't really do what the US wants it to do, and yet it is constrained by NATO in some ways.
Mhm. Well, that's true. And really, what the U.S. their opinion on this Syria situation, I don't think matters to Erdogan. But what's really interesting is that the SDF, which is the Kurdish group, I mean, they've said when the U.S. because Trump said a few times he was going to pull out of Syria, but he never did. The Kurds have said, okay, well, then we're just going to, normalize with Damascus. We're going to join the Syrian military.
Yeah.
They've always said that going back to Assad is always an option for them. They're more worried about Turkey than Assad, and that kind of goes against the whole narrative
You
in the
see that the
U.S.
big issue in that Kurdish region, I'm somewhat familiar with it, given my wife's from Iran, is the biggest threat to the Kurds has always been Turkey.
Mhm.
It overrides, even during Saddam Hussein. Okay, he was an exception because he actually did kill a lot of them. But even under Iraq and Saddam Hussein, they could live tolerably under him. But Turkey has actively, with US weapons, by the way, oppressed the Kurdish population. So, that sort of overrides sometimes the considerations. But the Kurds also know that they've always been exploited by whoever's got an interest in that region, whether it's Iran, whether it's Iraq, whatever. So they're very good at negotiating themselves with, into these inconvenient marriages.
Yeah. And I mean, it was always going to be a problem for the U.S. backing them against ISIS, right on Turkey's border. And, the US could have done that and then gotten out, but they just want to stay. They don't want to leave. I mean, really, they're in the way right now of kind of a reconciliation because an SDF commander, he said this to a Saudi newspaper. He said that they're willing to reintegrate into the Syrian Arab army. And then the idea there, I'm not sure if he said this, but somebody said this, would be then where Turkey is in the north, they want like a buffer between them and the Kurdish and the SDF. But if they rejoin the Syrian army, then Arab troops could go in the border regions, and Turkey potentially could withdraw. That could be a potential deal. I'm not saying that it would definitely work or anything, but that's never going to happen with the U.S. there. They're never going to let the SDF rejoin.
See,
And
there's another issue which is I don't see it get a lot of traction, but it's the question of water in that region.
Mhm.
the water, most of the water of Turkey comes from those mountainous areas, and it's also the catchment area of the Euphrates and the Tigris River. So historically, that's why the Kurds has always been in a difficult geopolitical problem. And also, if you go to Iran's side, the north of Iran towards the Caspian Sea is where the water comes from. So that there's always soldiers and stuff over there, but that is changing, mainly because of desalination technology. So Israel was the first to really, with US help, they sort of got desalination going, and now the Saudis are into it. And it seems that all the countries in those regions, Iran including, is looking into desalination. So I don't know, there's conflict in Baluchistan in Iran. That's got a lot to do with water as well. And the Iranians have invested into desalination, or they wanted to. I'm not sure if they fixed it, but anyway. So the idea was to try and make that area less geopolitical. So potentially there's a way to solve it. If people would accept those solutions.
Yeah. That's interesting. I don't know much about that. The water situation there. But I do really think that the U.S. is, in the way of a deal like that happening. But I guess they give, the SDF enough weapons and support that they're not willing to, kick the U.S. out. But they haven't been happy with them because Turkey in November, they launched some pretty major airstrikes against the Kurds there. And the U.S. didn't really do anything about it. They didn't even really tell them to stop. When they first started it, they said, oh, Turkey has, its own security interests. So the SDF isn't happy with the U.S. about that. But the U.S. keep saying, that we have no plans to leave Syria, to lift the sanctions, nothing. So I don't know if we're going to see a change. But
and is there really an interest to the United States in doing any of this? I mean, that's sort of another question in my mind. Is like, what do you win from this? I mean, you have your own energy now. You have your own water on the other side of the world. I mean, okay, assuming you care of Israel, I don't think Syria is a threat to Israel, but what are you doing there?
I think it is a lot about Israel and Iran because they don't want Iran in those areas. They want to disrupt, what they call the land bridge between Syria and Iran and that part of eastern Syria. And, that's what Trump was told when he said he was going to withdraw. If you remember, it was the end of 2019. Turkey was, going to launch an invasion against the Kurds. Trump got out of the way. He pulled the U.S. troops out of like the areas near Turkey's border, and he said he was going to withdraw altogether. And everybody freaked out in Washington, in Congress, saying that he's going to abandon the Kurds. But that's not what really convinced him to stay. He was told by, I think it was Lindsey Graham and some other hawks. They showed him the oil fields. They came into his office with a big, picture of him, of a big map. They said, if you leave, Iran's going to get all these oil fields. So you got to stay because of Iran. And that's why Trump ended up staying.
Well, at least he was honest about why he was there, unlike the other president who said it was of freedom and
Yeah.
democracy.
Yeah, and he said, I'm going to stay to secure the oil. That's what he said. So, and a lot of it is about Iran, especially when it came to Trump, because, he came in saying all this stuff about ending wars, and he did sign a deal that ultimately ended the war in Afghanistan, which Biden finished. But he was always really hawkish on Iran. And if you're really hawkish on Iran and really pro-Israel and you're an American president, you're not leaving the Middle East.
Exactly, yeah.
So, I think the U.S. is always going to have that presence there.
Do you know anything of this conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia? It seems to be quite underreported, at least in our media. And, in France, there's a big Armenian diaspora, so they've been lobbying the French government for some support, but I couldn't figure out really, what the big conflict's about.
Yeah, I'm not sure, like right now, exactly what's going on, but there was the Nagorno-Karabakh war at the end of 2020, which that was like a frozen conflict for decades since the end of the Cold War.
Right.
And Azerbaijan took that, which is like an ethnic Armenian enclave. Technically, these are borders that were drawn by Stalin and the Soviet Union to kind of divide the Azeris. As far as I understand it, this was Justin Raimondo, who founded Antiwar.com. He died in 2019, but he followed this conflict pretty closely, and all his writings that I've read on it, basically they drew these borders to kind of sow this ethnic division between the Armenians and the Azeris, so they don't, rise up against the Soviet Union. So then the war ends, Cold War ends, Soviet Union collapses. And there was a lot of fighting in the final years of the Soviet Union between the Armenians and the Azeris. So Nagorno-Karabakh was kind of this Armenian, de facto independent state that is part of uh, within the what they call the internationally recognized borders of Azerbaijan, but it's Armenian and acts as a de facto independent state. Well, that's pretty much over because Azerbaijan took most of the territory around it in 2020. And
Oh,
since
okay.
then, again, it's been frozen. There's more territory that they want from Armenia. I think again, it's not something I'm too
Mm.
like what's happening right now. I'm not exactly sure. I've seen some people saying Azerbaijan is like blockading a part of Armenia or Nagorno Karabakh where there's ethnic Armenians. But it is another area like it could always turn it. A war
Well,
could
the
always
the
happen.
interesting there's a few interesting sort of things that's about that conflict. Like many conflicts, it doesn't there's a logic, but it doesn't really make sense. So, for example, the north of Iran is Azuri. They call them Turks in Iran, but they're actually Azuri. So they speak the same language in Azerbaijan. If you go to Astara, it's a city on the border. I was there 2 years ago. You can practically walk over to Azerbaijan, and it's on the Caspian Sea. Um, but the Iranian government is not supporting Azerbaijan; they're supporting Armenia. And there is a big Armenian diaspora, particularly in Esfahan, in the middle of Iran. That is, they're a Christian church. They've got their own church in their own quarter in Iran, and
Mhm.
they officially recognized as a religion by the Iranian government, which is very interesting phenomenon. So you have this weird thing where the Muslim Iran is supporting Christian, Orthodox Christian Armenia against Azerbaijan, even though 20% of Iran speaks, Azuri, which doesn't make
Mhm.
any sense. And I know Russia at one stage was involved there. And also this year, the European Union, or last year, no, the European Union was criticized because they are still accepting gas from Azerbaijan who invaded Armenia, but not from Putin. So they're saying, why do you take one dictator over another? So none of this stuff makes sense.
Yeah, it is. It's a complicated conflict, and a lot of people want it to make sense. Like when Azerbaijan started, they shelled Armenia recently, and you had all these people saying because Armenia is a Russian treaty ally, and Russia has troops deployed there. That was as part of the ceasefire was that Russian peacekeepers would be deployed to the region. So you see a lot of people say, "Oh, it's NATO trying to open another front against Russia," but that's not true because then you had Nancy Pelosi go to Armenia after she visited Taiwan. She went
Exactly.
over to Armenia because there's a big Armenia lobby in the U.S. and a lot of people in Congress are more pro Armenia. But if you look at the numbers, the US gives much more military aid to Azerbaijan. It generally skews more pro Azeri, but it's not like black and white. Like it's not like the US is on one side. And you really saw that because while this war was going on, the US didn't really pick a side, which how rarely does that happen?
Yeah, or maybe it's too far away for America to intervene. Maybe the
Mhm.
US was weighing up the options. But it's a strange conflict because you have the potential weird thing where France and Iran is now teaming up against Azerbaijan while the EU is buying gas from Azerbaijan. It's sort of like the
Mhm.
dots just doesn't want to connect. You shouldn't try to even
And
wrap your head
Turkey, of
around.
course, is on the
Oh yeah.
big supporter of Azerbaijan. Gave them a ton of military support, and it. I don't know if this was ever confirmed, but during that war at the end of 2020, there was all these reports that Turkey was sending mercenaries to fight for Azerbaijan from Syria,
Mhm.
shipping them over there. So they're huge supporters of
Well,
Azerbaijan.
the other thing that's taking place is the Iran's internal demographics is changing. So the Persian population is becoming a smaller percentage. There'll still be a majority, but they're 50 as opposed to 70% now. And the Azerbaijanis in the north are becoming dominant in certain provinces. So the Turks have figured out, because remember, Azerbaijan's in Iran, they're known as Turks. So there's been like a greater Turk propaganda narrative being sold to that region. Not that all of them buy it, but some people have bought into it. So there's like been attempts of destabilizing Iran through that conflict via Turkey. And this is sort of where Turkey is the very strange country in NATO, because it seems to be doing what the US is doing, although it's much smaller, but it's still acting as a semi-imperialist power in its own territory.
Yeah, yeah. And what Turkey's doing there, like again, going back to just people saying, "Oh, it's NATO," NATO's on Azerbaijan's side, but just because Turkey is on their side, Turkey is not representative of what NATO is doing really
Yeah.
at large. They're very much a rogue member. But yeah, I mean Erdogan, he has his eyes on a lot of things. He really intervened in Libya. I mean, he's been all over trying to, push his, kind of expand Turkey's influence in the region.
Yeah, no, so it's one another interesting conflict to watch for, and then the other one obviously is Israel-Palestine, where I mean it's just tiresome thinking of what if that thing's ever going to be solved, if there's ever going to be a one-state or a two-state solution or no state solution.
Yeah, that's things are getting pretty hairy there with this new government that Netanyahu formed. Because to make his government, his coalition includes really, extremist settlers that want to push all the Palestinians out. And now they have a lot of power. So something's probably going to pop off there. In the West Bank in 2022, there was already a lot of violence, one of the deadliest years for Palestinians there. And he had Ben Gavir, who is, I forget what his position is, but he's a minister in Netanyahu's government.
Isn't he Minister of Intelligence or something of the sort? Like he's got some weird security job.
Some security thing, but I think it's like they always make new ministers when they form governments, but it is like a national security thing, but he's not like the national security advisor. But anyway, he went to Al-Aqsa, the mosque in occupied East Jerusalem, and it's always controversial when settlers go there. And he had to make a point, right after this new government was formed, even though apparently Netanyahu told him not to do it. He went there, and some rockets were fired out of Gaza. So yeah, things are getting pretty hairy there. And their coalition declared that, one of their priorities is going to be expanding settlements in the West Bank and eventually annex the territory. So that's what they're saying they're going to do. And yeah, and it's not just, pro people that are pro Palestine that are warning about this new government. It's the Israeli military put out all this stuff.
I mean, I've spoken here to a friend of mine who lives in Israel, and she's very supportive of the government and what she does. And she also said to me, like, this government is right wing, which is somebody that I didn't expect it from. So like, this is right wing, and we should be careful what they're doing. And it's sort of a problem here because I have some sympathy to Israel's existence and stuff, but at the same time, you have to recognize that situation with the Palestinians is not on.
Yeah, and it's not tenable. Like this situation can't go on forever. I mean, Gaza's been under blockade for like 15 years now, 16 years. And again, with the settlements, they're just slowly expanding. That makes a two-state solution impossible, really. So, it's going to come to a boil. And they say, there was just this MP from the party, the Jewish Power Party, is what Netanyahu coalitioned with, just saying, oh, we need a final war, to subdue the Palestinians once and for all. But there's millions of them. They're not going anywhere.
I mean, what do you think is going to be the end game there? Because my view has been, if the two-state solution is just a smokescreen, and I in the beginning I sort of thought it would work, and now I realize it's probably never going to happen anyways. I mean, eventually the Israelis are going to run into the problem we had in South Africa. We're just swamped by demographics, and you have to surrender power.
That is something I think is in their calculation, is why they couldn't annex the West Bank right now if they wanted to. The U.S. probably would actually start leveraging, threatening to withhold aid or something if they just went to do it outright. Because if they did it right now, like they just annexed the West Bank and said, okay, these Palestinians are Israeli citizens, I think the demographics are about 50-50. But they don't want that. They want, to be the majority. They want the Jews to be the majority over the Arab Palestinian, the Muslim Arabs. So I think they would like to push more Palestinians out. The question is, how are they going to do that, and what's going to happen? I really don't know. I can't imagine any scenario like in the future. It's just it's a situation that can't go on forever. It doesn't seem like it could go on much longer, yet it seems to just continue.
Well, I get the impression sometimes that nobody wants to solve that conflict, and people are sort of happy with this weird arrangement. And, it sort of makes the argument again why the US should just get out. I mean, although getting out of Israel is far more difficult than the other conflict, given the amount of investment in America. But it just seems to be the British couldn't solve it. When was this? After the Balfour Declaration, or after they gave up Israel, the Palestine colony. Maybe it's just better off leaving them to solve it themselves.
Yeah. I mean, part of the reason why they're able to do what they do is because they get all this support from the U.S. I mean, that was more so as they were, as when they first became a state, which would have never happened without the Western support. And then for those decades, with that U.S. support, that's why they were able to do so much. And now, today, they would be able to do a lot more on their own. But still, just having the full backing of the U.S. really lets them get away with a lot. I mean, in 2021, in spring, that was the last like really major Gaza bombing campaign. It lasted just a few weeks, but a few hundred Palestinians were killed.
Yeah.
And right after that, they got more aid from the U.S. They said, "Hey, we need another $1 billion in military aid," and the U.S. gave it to them. So they're totally emboldened by the U.S. support. Um, so
And that's the problem, I think, when you start sort of prioritizing military aid over diplomatic solutions. I mean, I'll give you an example of something that was quite good news coming from that part of the world. Is these peace deals between Israel and what was it, UAE, and I think even the Saudis were sort of on board. I mean, it's not. I know people were criticizing a little bit, but coming back to the water story, that sort of had to do with desalination technology being sold by Israel. So again, those type of solutions are being suppressed for that region because of the military. Because the only solution the US seems to have is throwing more weapons at the problem.
well, a big part of those deals is there's a huge military aspect to it,
Right.
because what the US and Israel want as well is they want to form kind of like a Middle East NATO against Iran between Israel and those Gulf Arab states. Uh, and if you saw what the UAE got for signing that deal with Israel, they got about a $30 billion arms deal,
Oh.
with I think they're getting the F-35 jets and all sorts of missiles and stuff, because that is a big part of it, of those, what they call peace deals. So, and I think, I guess it will expand trade, but I know they were trading to some extent already. But and the Saudis do seem like they're going to eventually sign a deal like that. But with this new government, that might put it in jeopardy, because when Netanyahu signed those deals with the UAE and Bahrain, he said he wouldn't annex the West Bank, and then they come in and basically say that they're going to do it. But I don't know if the Gulf, the monarchs, they don't really care so much about the Palestinians. But it might be that the people of Saudi Arabia care enough that they're not going to normalize with Israel. So we'll see how
Well,
that
I
plays
mean,
out.
I don't know if you saw the World Cup, the Qatar World Cup stuff. There was quite a lot of critique against the Israeli journalists. Some
Yeah,
of it,
yeah.
a bit off the spectrum maybe, but it has to be said that that part of the world has some, at least the people have a lot more empathy for the Palestinians.
Yes. Yeah. And that's why I don't know if it was MBS, but it was some Saudi, high level prince or something that said, we can't normalize with Israel or our people are going to kill us. And, how often do they worry about what their people, think? But in that
Right.
situation, it's like, that's something we can't do.
Well, I mean, okay. I hope that conflict gets sort of buried as well or gets solved, but that's very hopeful. The other place of the world I want to look at is Africa a little bit. I mean, I saw on your website there was bombings in Somalia again, and I know. I mean, don't your site is great, but you don't have a lot of data sometimes in Africa, and I think the reason is even we from Africa don't have data on our own continent.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really tough, and that's one thing, like, I should follow more, is kind of the stuff in, like, Mozambique and other conflicts around Africa. Um, when it comes to Somalia, I always report the airstrikes, but there's nothing else. I mean, I'm basing that on the US military's press releases,
Yeah,
and that, like, we know that we can't take them for their word. They say that they killed Al-Shabaab fighters. No civilians were hurt, don't worry about it, but we don't know that. And anytime journalists or anything kind of gets out from on the ground in Somalia, it always tells a much different story than what the U.S. government is telling. And also, the government that the U.S. backs in Mogadishu, they have they just enacted some really strict laws against journalists, and anything they publish about the war against Al Shabaab, because they just launched a pretty serious offensive against Al-Shabaab like a few months back. So there's been a lot of fighting on the ground, but what they publish, they have to get it approved by the government. So that government's not going to want to put out that, these US airstrikes have killed civilians or anything. So yeah, we just have no idea. And I mean, there's been times where I write up a story about a US airstrike in Somalia, which have been increasing. and it's based on an AFRICOM press release, and it's not anywhere else, not in any other English language media that I could find.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's how unreported and how little people
Well,
care
to give
about
an
it.
example, like Somalia, I mean, if you take South Africa's press, which is probably the most established in Africa, I mean, we got full coverage of Ukraine, but we got nothing of Mozambique, which is next door. It's literally we have refugees
Yeah,
from Mozambique
yeah.
in South Africa at the moment, and from Zimbabwe, which is another conflict that is just, I mean, it's not really a war anymore, but it's sanctioned like Syria, and it's been sanctioned that way since the 1980s by the US sanctions. It was a lot of coverage a few years ago still, but now we don't even hear about it anymore. A quarter of Zimbabwe's population lives in South Africa, so
Wow.
it's just I don't
Yeah, that
I
is
cannot explain it.
amazing. Yeah, even Africans, yeah, aren't getting the information.
Oh.
And people just don't care. Like, I don't know how to make people in America care about this war that we're involved in Somalia that nobody seems to know about. Um, it was one kind of bright spot of Biden's presidency because Trump really ramped up airstrikes in Somalia. Then when Biden came in, they went way down. But then they've been slowly going back up. He sent more troops there. Um, so it seems like it's kind of,
Well, one aspect I've been always curious about is the military contractors. There's a lot of South African military contractors that were even in Iraq and Afghanistan, and because we had some unique law that they could register as private companies in the country, and then the government used that to funnel tax, so sort of incentivizing these things. And a lot of them were fighting these wars or working as security guards. And I know in Somalia, I've known a few people that were there. And if you ever go to the north of Pretoria, capital of South Africa, there's big like houses like in the north built, and they're all working this private security industry. And I've just never been able to figure out exactly what they do and if it's dodgy or if it's not dodgy, tradings. But it just doesn't
yeah.
get reported on.
Yeah. And like how involved they really are in like the fighting and stuff.
You
Yeah.
don't know, yeah. And they won't tell you anyways if you ask them because it's secrecy. And how these military guys are. They don't tell you anything that can incriminate them,
Yeah.
potentially get
Yeah.
into the media.
Hmm.
Yeah. So okay, so that's sort of the anti-war, picture this year. It doesn't look like a rosy picture. Is there anything hopeful that you've got that conflicts that might be solved? I mean, I saw there was something about Yemen last year that the US was about to vote. Did that ever happen?
Yeah. So Yemen, the good news about Yemen is that there was a ceasefire between the Saudis and the Houthis that was enacted at the end of March last year. It expired in October, but during that whole time, there was no Saudi airstrikes in Yemen. And even since the ceasefire expired, there haven't been any. And the blockade, because they enacted a blockade on the country in 2015, with the backing of the US, was eased slightly. They started letting more ships into Hodeidah, which is their port on the Red Sea. And they let limited flights in and out of the Sana'a airport, which was closed for years. So the people of Yemen got some serious relief from that. And they're still getting it, but there has been an increase in fighting on the ground, and Saudi shelling and Houthi attack and oil infrastructure and stuff that is being controlled still by the U.S. Saudi backed government. So and that fighting is increasing on the ground right now. And there was this war powers resolution introduced in Congress in the U.S. that would have ended U.S. support for the Saudi war, the UAE Saudi war, more so Saudi, but uh, this aspect of it is more so Saudi because it's about the maintenance and intelligence and logistics support that the U.S. gives them. And their Air Force is pretty much entirely reliant on this U.S. support. So if this bill was passed and sent to Biden, it would have pressured them because what they need right now is a real peace deal, a sustainable political deal.
Mhm.
And it's going to be hard to get. But if the U.S. kind of leaned on the Saudis, it would be much more realistic. And that's what this legislation would have done, but it was killed.
Will the Saudis bow to U.S. pressure? Because I mean, what's the story with this petrodollar thing that's also been doing rounds in the media?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. But when it comes to this war, they need this U.S. support, or they can't fight it. They can't fly their planes. Like that's how
Yeah.
reliant they are. Um, but but there's a lot to the U.S. Saudi relationship right now, and I think that's part of the reason why. So this bill was introduced in the Senate and the House, and it had a lot of bipartisan support. And Bernie Sanders was going to introduce it, but the White House worked against it. and he caved to the pressure, and they never introduced it. And I think part of the reason why the White House was against it is because of kind of these issues that they've had with the Saudis and OPEC plus, cutting oil production. They don't want to ruffle the Saudi feathers too much right now, because what the Saudis did, which they do, it seems like every once in a while, and it's smart of them, is they, hosted Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, and they said, yeah, we're going to really be buddies and increase cooperation. And that is a threat to the U.S. And of course, the petrodollar, the U.S. dollar, is backed by the fact that that's what it's used to trade oil, and the Saudis changing that would be huge. And it would still take a very long time, even if the Saudis decided to do that, that the US dollar would really get hurt by it. But what they did there, I think, was say, hey, you can't just ditch us. You can't get rid of us too easily. You have to kind of give us what we want. So unfortunately, it looks like the war in Yemen isn't settled, and it could really escalate at any time. And this coalition throughout the war, I mean, they were brutal, bombing civilian infrastructure, bombing farms, bombing sheep and fishing boats, and
Yeah, and then
just
using food as
anything
a
they,
weapon of war, which was just insane.
yeah, bombing their water, their sewage, their water treatment facilities. Really brutal, spreading disease and starvation to the people of Yemen, killing hundreds of thousands of innocent people. So it's as bad, brutal as it can be. So there's always a risk of it restarting. At the same time, the Houthis did start getting pretty good at hitting Saudi oil infrastructure. So I think there is will on the Saudi end to end this war, but they don't want to give the Houthis, everything that they want.
But is there a coordination, like a coordinated structure among the Houthis? I mean, do they have a leader or a president? Because I had Issa Blumi, and it wasn't clear to me from what he said that the Houthis are really a unified group either. They seem to be a bit of a decentralized mobs of some sort.
Oh yeah, as far as I know, I mean, they have a leader, and they are basically the government in a lot of areas of Yemen
Okay.
that they control, as far as I understand it. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, it might be. It's just, I mean, we hear of the Houthis. We don't know. There's no Osama bin Houthi, yet that I've heard of in the media. But
There is a
yeah,
leader, Al Houthi. I forget his,
okay.
and he's like the son or their original leader in the 1990s. But yeah, I mean, how organized exactly they are on the ground, I guess I'm not really sure.
No.
Scott Horton, if you're familiar with him, he interviews a guy named Nasser Arabi a lot, he's a Yemeni journalist that lives, in Houthi controlled areas. And he's not, a Zaidi Shia. He's not like a Houthi, but he
Mm.
basically considers them like, like they're the ones in charge now. Pretty much the government of the area that he lives in.
And what do you make of the accusation that Iran is giving them weapons? Because some people have been saying that's nonsense.
Yeah, well, it's tough to really know, because the country's been under blockade, and the Houthis did get really good at they got these nice drones and missiles that they can hit Saudi Arabia with now. But they did, and there was actually a lot of reporting on this in Western media. In the Wall Street Journal is one article I can think of. They started really producing drones domestically. But that kind of all went away once they started hitting Saudi Arabia, because then the talking point became, oh, the Iran sending these weapons. And I think Iran, I'm sure, has sent them weapons to some extent, but I think it's more likely that they kind of help them with plans and ways to build these drones domestically, just because we haven't seen big seizures of drones going into Yemen or anything. And when it comes to just overall, they're treated as an Iranian proxy, but that's not a good way to characterize them. They receive support from Iran, and but they're really a homegrown movement that came out of the Zaidi Shias that controlled North Yemen for 1,000 years. That area of Yemen was ruled by Zaidi Shia imams for 1,000 years until the 1960s.
Yeah, and those Shiites, as far as I understand, are not really recognized as true Shiites by Iran either. There's some dispute,
Yeah, they're
flaws.
the Zaidi. I'm not sure about the inter-Shia stuff, but I know they are a different type. They're not the 12er Shias that.
Yeah, it's difficult keeping up with all these groups, because the media just throws them at you.
Yeah, but that's the important point,
yeah.
is basically that they're not an Iranian proxy. You can't really describe them as that, because it's not like Iran created them. They're their own thing. Um, and how much support they receive from Iran, we don't really know. But we do know how much support the other side receives from the U.S. and France and the UK. It's very blatant and out in the open. So it is funny how they want us to focus on Iran's support for the Houthis and kind of ignore all the U.S. support.
The last point I'd sort of like to get your view in is the sort of this domestic war on terror talk that has taken place in, I think since Biden became president, really. I mean, there was now this talk of fighting white supremacy at home and fighting, I don't know what else, this January 6th type of riots. My sense of it, having seen it from the media, is I actually don't know what to make of it in America, because I know those accusations have been labeled against dissidents in the past as well. Um, so what do you make of that whole story?
Yeah, well, you started seeing it towards the end of the Trump administration, the FBI saying, that the greatest threat is like domestic white supremacy terrorism, which to me as an American, it's just seems like it's a lot of nonsense, a lot of
Yeah.
overblown. And they frame a lot of people that are right wing as white supremacists, even like the people that the Trump supporters that entered the Capitol building on January 6th. That's kind of the talking point, is that they're all white supremacists, but that's not really the case. A lot of right wing Americans that are more in favor of limited government, can be put on a list by the FBI and can be labeled domestic terrorists. I mean, myself, I'm a libertarian. A lot of people would consider me to be pretty right wing. But so I think it
Well,
is a
everyone is a Nazi except those guys in Ukraine.
exactly, yeah, yeah. That's what's so ridiculous about it, is that they call so many Americans Nazis, but and they just ignore all the ones that are in Ukraine.
Well, I
Um,
mean, I don't know if America's had a. I mean, I might be wrong, but I don't think you've really had a domestic war on terror. You had some McCarthyism at one stage, but not to the extent that we had in South Africa in the 80s, which was essentially turning the country into police state.
mhm.
And that's actually what is part of one of the many things that brought down the regime. So it can become very dangerous when you start using, because the big mistake they made in South Africa was they started using the military for policing work, and they started militarizing the police. And then at one stage, you didn't know what the distinction was between a soldier and a policeman.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, it's like that in a lot of places here in the U.S. That they have really militarized the police. And there have been instances where they've killed a lot of Americans. Of course, Waco in the early 1990s and Ruby Ridge before that, when the ATF and the FBI, getting kind of dubious search warrants, and they end up, in this mass slaughter of people because something just happened in Australia that I want to look into. I know this is kind of different, but there was basically the police like entered somebody's property based on the fact that they were like conspiracy theorists based on what they posted online, and then they saw these police and they started shooting and a bunch of people got killed. So that's always a big risk when you turn militarize the police, and then especially if you're turning the war on terror domestically. um it's definitely.
and I mean, with the surveillance infrastructure today, it's so difficult, to even know if the authorities are doing it. I mean, because back in the past, at least there was some media press and criticism. Today, they just memory hole whatever's been done.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you gotta kind of assume, if you're using a computer or a smartphone, that, if you gotta just be careful with what you do, because just assume that they can see what you're doing.
Yeah.
Especially for us, it being kind of alternative media that goes against a lot of the narrative. Like, I kind of just assume that I am on some watch list. And I do take measures to avoid certain things, but um, you know, it is unfortunate that when it comes to the internet, if you're messaging people, there's not really a safe way. I mean, there's Signal, there's encrypted messaging apps, I guess you could use, but especially if you're on Twitter DMing people, just assume, especially with what we just learned about Twitter, them working so closely with the FBI, play it safe and just assume that somebody's watching you.
Well, I mean, was it really news that social media is, in cahoots with these guys?
Yeah, no, I don't. Most people weren't really surprised. I think the extent of it was pretty surprising. Just how, from those documents that they've been putting out, the coordination, like the level of it is pretty amazing, and how they're asking to remove all these accounts. They even paid Twitter a few $1 million, the FBI.
But I mean, that's just the FBI. I mean, the CIA.
You're right. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing that I am quite convinced of is that there's a deliberate attempt to manipulate some media stories. I mean, Russia Ukraine's a good example of this, but just something less benign stuff. If especially these international news agencies, and then that's why whatever happens on the battlefield, I don't even know if it's true anymore, because is it being manipulated to get me to hold a certain view, or is it actual informative information? You just don't know sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's probably much bigger than we can even imagine, like, how much, not just the intelligence agencies, but even the military. I mean, that was one of the Twitter files that was released, was that US Central Command, the command that oversees the Middle East, was running psyops on Twitter. They had, fake accounts, and one of the places was Yemen. They had, like, these fake accounts that were people living in Yemen saying how bad the Houthis were, and how US drone strikes only kill terrorists.
Well,
And Twitter knew that, and let these accounts exist.
Well, we're seeing this now with Iran. I mean, what everyone thinks of this protest, we know that the Mujahideen Khalq, which is I think it's a Saudi slash Iranian slash US funded terrorist group in Iran,
Yeah.
has got like a town in Albania, which is just weird, where they have
Yeah,
got an
they're
army
very
of Twitter trolls.
yeah, they're a very strange group. And a lot of the information about is coming through that, like, Iran International,
Yeah.
that's based in the UK, Saudi funded. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, and
it's
they're
really
blowing
tough
up
to
the
know.
propaganda, and it's got a weird thing where it's radicalizing the Iranian diaspora because they watch that stuff.
Mhm.
But inside Iran, it's when I speak to my family, for example, the story is a little bit different, and it's a bit more nuanced, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
that's got its other effects. So it's very strange to make sense of the whole media ecosystem.
Yeah, it is. It's tough to figure it all
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Anyways, Dave, thank you very much for this. I say to everyone, please read antiwar.com from every now and then, and maybe give them a little bit of a donation when they have one of their funds. And I really
Yeah.
appreciate what you guys do. It's a good message.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. And if people want to check out, I also do a podcast that's a daily podcast called
Hmm.
Anti-War News. It's 5 days a week. You could see the YouTube channel on the page, but it's also, if you want to listen to the audio, you could download it wherever you listen to podcasts.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.